In today's session, we're going to be discussing how sleep affects the scale weight. So, I get this question quite a lot from clients, and that's why does my weight fluctuate so much across the week? So, sleep has a really big impact on that, and that's why we're going to dive into that a little bit today. So, the science behind why your sleep quality matters more than your diet and what the number on the scale actually means. So, when we don't get enough sleep, it directly affects the hormones that control hunger. So, when you're getting fewer than 6 to 7 hours per night, your body actually triggers a cascade of hormonal shifts. So, ghrelin, which is our hunger hormone, increases, which makes us feel quite ravenous the next day. And then we've got leptin, which is our fullness hormone, actually decreases. So we never actually feel quite full and quite satisfied. So what that results in is a really the cravings, quick carbs and sugar. We tend to eat larger portions, which does stall fat loss even when we're trying really hard. So basically, not having enough sleep creates this change in our hormones that is really hard to control. Okay, so even the most disciplined people actually really struggle in this aspect because it's biological hormonal signaling. It's not actually a lack of willpower or a lack of motivation. Um, so, again, when we're not having enough sleep, it actually changes those hormones so that hunger hormone ghrelin increases. So we wake up and we're actually wanting to have like quick carbs, such as sugar, and we want to eat more because the body's needing that fuel. So that can have a big impact on our scale weight. So what can also happen is our cortisol. So our stress hormone surges with poor sleep, so we become more stressed. We have some water retention, so the fluid accumulates, and that actually, especially around the midsection. We end up with some extra inflammation, so that systemic puffiness, and that also shows up on the scale. And our digestion slows down. So while we sleep, that's when our digestive system is working its hardest. So it's digesting all of our foods, it's processing everything like it needs to. And if we're not sleeping, that process isn't actually happening. So it does then slow down that digestive process. So you might be eating perfectly, you might be training hard, and then you step on the scales and it's gone up, zero point 0.5 to 2 kilos. And then you get stressed about that because you think that that's fat gain. But it's often, well, it's not. What that is it's stress and water retention, and it's not fat gain. So your high cortisol levels can raise your blood sugar, and what that does is increase the abdominal fat storage over time. Okay, so that's going to make you look and feel quite puffy. So that sleep deprivation over a long period of time um, can what's that word? Can contribute to those high cortisol levels, the higher blood sugar levels, and that increase in abdominal fat storage. But if you have, say, one or two bad night sleeps in the week, it can increase the scale weight because of those things like higher cortisol, your ghrelin and leptin hormones, your water retention, your inflammation, and that slower digestion. So when we're looking at, when we get 7 to 9 hours sleep per night, we're looking at stable hunger hormones, better insulin sensitivity. We've got stronger recovery, more muscle retention, lower cortisol, and then that results in a higher percentage of actual fat loss. When we have 5, 6 hours or less, we have higher cravings, reduced insulin sensitivity, poor recovery, elevated cortisol, accelerated muscle loss while dieting, and that's going to result in more muscle loss and less fat loss. So what happens then is that poor sleep doesn't just affect one way in. It creates that self-reinforcing loop that compounds over time. So we've got poor sleep, which leads to higher cortisol, which leads to water retention. Then the scale increases. Then we often get more stress because the scale's increasing and we're like, we're doing everything right. And then that goes back to the poor sleep. So it ends up becoming that self-reinforcing loop. So breaking that cycle and having intentional sleep hygiene leads to having better sleep, and those stress management strategies become really useful. So, I mean, sleep hygiene is a whole nother topic that we can cover, but just understanding that sleep actually has a really significant impact on not only the scale weight, but on all these other factors as well. So, a really important thing to note is that scale weight doesn't just measure fat. Okay, so scale reflects your physiology, not just the calories that you're eating. So, it takes into account your fat and your muscle, inflammation, water and glycogen, and your food volume and what's happening with your hormones. So there's a lot that goes into what the scale weight is actually telling us. So that's why it's really important that when we're on we're on this health and fitness journey, that weighing regularly and inputting that data is really important so we can see those trends over time. Because if you just weigh yourself, say, once a week, that might be a really high day. That might actually be the highest day that you have that week, without knowing what your scale weight has been like for the other parts of the week. We can't really make those informed decisions about where to go with like your nutrition and your training, and do you need extra recovery and those type of things. So yeah, it is just a number, and it is one form of measurement. That's why we take lots of other measurements into account. But yeah, it is quite important to see those trends and see what's happening over the week. So just coming back to that insulin resistance. So when sleep is reduced, so even just by a single night, your body becomes less sensitive to insulin. So this means carbohydrates are processed less efficiently and blood sugar regulation worsens. So that's when you get your increased cravings. So your body then signals for quick energy from sugar and refined carbs. And like prime example of this is like I had a terrible sleep last night. And usually when, I get up quite early, 3:30 in the morning, I get up, have my coffee, I have my normal routine, and I never feel like eating in the mornings before training. But I had such a terrible sleep last night. I actually woke up and I was craving, sugar and refined carbs. And I had made muffins the night before, and all I wanted was like one of those muffins. And, that's completely out of the norm for me. So it is something that really does trigger the cravings that we have and things that we, aren't really in control of. So that poor insulin management also pushes nutrients towards storage rather than fuel. Okay, so that's why we then start to end up with that higher fat storage risk, because then it does start to push that more towards storage rather than fuel. And then, having poor sleep, we also have the reduced gym performance. So less available energy means that our workouts are not as good as what they could be, and then our progression starts to slow down. Okay, so here's just a little, like tiny little bit of a science lesson. So insulin is like a key that unlocks your cells. which allows glucose, so the sugar from your food, to enter and be used for energy. So when you become insulin resistant, your cells stop responding effectively to that key. All right. So this is what happens when we have the not as much sleep as what we need. So we've got a normal cell. So the insulin key opens the door and the glucose enters the cell easily. When the cell becomes resistant, that insulin key fails, and so it doesn't open for the glucose to come in, and the glucose sits outside the cell. All right. So that cellular stubbornness means that glucose builds up in your bloodstream. So that signals the pancreas to produce even more insulin. That high insulin level then contributes to the increase in fat storage, particularly around that midsection. And then that's what makes fat loss more challenging. Okay, so this is why sleep is really important. It helps to regulate that whole flow of how glucose gets into the cells. So the three main things that can happen from consistently resistant insulin is we've got that stubborn fat gain. So your body struggles to burn fat and preferentially stores excess glucose as fat. All right, and that's particularly around the abdomen. We have chronic low energy. So despite eating, our glucose can't efficiently enter those cells for fuel, which leads to persistent fatigue. It leads to energy dips, and that happens especially after meals. Then we've got the intense cravings. So cells are crying out for the energy trigger. So then we've got strong urges for quick fixes like sugary foods and refined carbohydrates. But again, that key is not unlocking the cells for that to be able to get in there. All right, so we've got the stubborn fat gain, we've got the chronic low energy, and then we've got the intense cravings. So this often ends up again in that vicious cycle, and recognizing that and then being able to address those causes is really, really important. So sleep also impacts recovery and muscle retention. So you grow and repair muscle while you sleep. Okay, so while you sleep, that's when your growth hormone's getting released, and it peaks during that time where you're sleeping. So if you're not sleeping very well, that growth hormone is not getting triggered like it should. So that means your recovery decreases, your physical performance starts to drop, and the progressive overload becomes harder because the muscle retention is compromised. So remembering that muscle is metabolically an active tissue. So less recovery means less adaptation. So a slower metabolism, and it's a bit of a harder road to your goals. So sleep also impacts the recovery and muscle retention that we're trying to achieve through our strength training. So just to do a little bit of a recap, the overnight spike in scale weight can often be from water retention, sodium retention. So your stress hormones hold onto sodium and fluid. We've got inflammation, and we've got the slower digestion as well. And then, potentially the next day, because you might have eaten more because you've got those cravings, because our hunger hormones are all out of whack. So a couple of practical tips, and we can do another call about, sleep hygiene in itself, but 7 to 9 hours per night is pretty much non-negotiable. So for fat loss and muscle building, 7 to 9 hours is definitely what we need. So consistent scheduling of your sleep. So the same sleep time and wake time every day. And once that becomes consistent, then it's definitely, you just becomes habit and it becomes routine. Reducing blue light. So screens off 60 minutes before you go to bed always helps. So a cool and dark room. So that's optimizing your sleep environment, and magnesium and winding down. So taking magnesium at nighttime is great because it actually helps you sleep, and avoiding the late night scrolling. So and really heavy meals at nighttime. So what we do at Grit and Glow is that we look for trends and not single weigh-ins. We monitor stress and not just the macros. We individualize based on what's happening in your lifestyle. So if you're going through a really busy, stressful time and you're not sleeping very well, we might have to taper back some of that training to mitigate, that muscle loss and to increase recovery. So what I'm trying to do is to teach you how to think like an athlete and not like a dieter. This is like lifestyle changes that we're trying to make, and understanding the impacts that that sleep has on so many factors of your lifestyle.